think we'll take advantage of their time being here. Start by thanking Secretary Lucas Ferraz, Renato Agostinho from the Brazilian government, and also Rupert Schlegelmilch, who is the acting Deputy Director General for the EU, and Lucian Cernat, who is head of Global Regulatory Cooperation and International Procurement Negotiations. And we're all here today to talk about servicification in manufacturing for exports, custom regimes, and service goods. I will say that this is the fourth session that we have on this topic, and I want to thank Luiz Salles for sort of raising the torch on the services topic within ICC, and I know that Luiz has been working closely with the government to sort of advance this topic and figure out a structure that really benefits and incentivates services for the Brazilian economy. Luiz, I'll hand it over to you. I think you're the real expert on this topic, so you can tell us what we'll discuss today and lead the conversation from there. Again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. Thank you for your kindness. I wouldn't claim that, but I can say that I'm extremely happy to moderate this last event of our series on servicification and manufacturing, with a focus on customs regimes and around the world, and on potential lessons for Brazil based on those regimes. Now, I'm very happy also to say at this last webinar that we've had speakers from Argentina, Mexico, and the US at the opening event, where we also have Secretary Ferraz. So thank you for your support, Secretary. Then Russia, India, South Africa, from the BRICS countries, and then China, who's also a BRICS country, and Singapore and Indonesia for the Asian region. So today we have our last episode where we're going to have the EU representatives and the Brazilian government as well. Thank you all for your participation and support for the series. Now, what I think this series has sort of unveiled is that there is a need and a call for an agenda of convergence, and particularly convergence between trade policy and services. Now, of course, with our focus on customs regimes. But so before we start up, I'll just tell you a little story about convergence, which I think fits nicely with the people in the room. In 2019, I was selected to consult for UNCTAD on the interaction between services and trade policies, focusing on Brazil. I was picked to replace a previous consultant because he had to drop since he was appointed the Brazilian Secretary for Foreign Trade. Welcome, Secretary Ferraz. The support for that project within UNCTAD came from the EU through the Chief Economist Unit, which was headed by Mr. Cernat. So, Lucian, thank you for being here with us as well. And one of the key interviewees for that project regarding services, trade, and customs was Undersecretary Renato Agostinho, who's also here with us. So thank you, Renato, as well. And we had a roundtable at an international conference to discuss preliminary outcomes of the project. And I remember this was where actually I met Gabriela as well. So we're all here today. That makes me sort of proud on a personal level and happy. And this is a story of convergence, right? We've all converged here now to talk about a topic which I think gathers a lot of attention now, but less attention than it deserves, and where I think all of us on this panel will agree, I mean, should be a place to focus going forward. So I couldn't be happier to be here at the company of all of you, and also to have Deputy Director General Schlegelmilch. And I'm sorry that I have a sort of a limitation on pronouncing your last name, but thank you so much for joining. And with that, I'd like to hand over to you, Deputy Director General, to start. Then we'll hear a few words from Lucian Cernat before we pass on the floor to Secretary Ferraz. I hope that we will have a few minutes for a question or two at the end, but let's move on soon so we can hear from you, who are the stars really of our show today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and I hope technology works. I'm very pleased to be here. I also want to thank you, Luiz, and Gabriela, Lucian, who's been at the cradle of all this work, and all the other colleagues, also some of them, Lucas, I haven't met yet. I usually, when I talk to a Brazilian audience, I usually speak about the Mercosur agreement, which is my daytime job, to get this wonderful agreement ratified, including with intense discussions with all actors in Brazil, Argentina, Peru, and Uruguay. But today I'm very pleased to talk about this issue of services and trade and where are we, because it is important. It is important. The world is changing around us. And I want to start with a very simple question to the audience. What do you think, what does actually Volkswagen stand for? I'm German, yeah. So what is Volkswagen? What kind of company is it? Yeah. So most people would say it's a car company, but if you look what they announced last week, they said, no, we are a software company, or we will be a software company. In any case, we might not be there yet, but forget about the cars. Yeah? So, I mean, if a company like Volkswagen, who together with Toyota is the biggest producer of cars, comes out with statements like that, I think it tells you something. And it tells you actually that the role of services in international trade, in the beginning we said, well, services enable trade. They are part of the value chain. You need financial services, you need logistics, you need telecoms to trade. That is yesterday's view of where services fits in the trade world. Today we see, and this is the theme of the good work that we are doing here and that we try to socialize more, the manufactured products really are part of the game because there's so much embedded software in manufactured products. A pacemaker that we all might hopefully not need has 80,000 lines of codes. And bigger products. And if you look at the Boeing issue with 6 million lines of software, and if you get it wrong, you have huge problems, by the way. The amount of software which goes into modern technology, into modern products, manufactured products, is growing, and not only in Volkswagen. And this is not just developed countries at the cutting edge, it's happening everywhere. It's happening in Africa, where farmers use sensors to start looking at the soil moisture, or they use infrared Internet of Things. All of this is important not only for us here in Europe, it's important for the whole world, because these embedded software in sometimes very simple products have a real role to play also in agriculture and harvesting in developing countries, moving up the value chains. So where we are is we actually talk about goods in the trading system, but these goods are actually a mixture of goods and services, and it's becoming ever more so. And our WTO, that we all know very well, at least the trade experts, which has separate agreements on trading goods, separate agreement on trade and services, and different rules. And the services agreement for those who deal with that is very complicated, because you have services which are supplied on the ground, or which are applied without commercial presence, as we call it. All of that is not really up to what's happening in the embedded sphere, where goods and services actually come together. We should actually have one regime for all of this. And this is why we came up with this idea of mode 5 in services. It's not only delivering in the modes we know, via natural persons, or via, as I said, commercial presence, or consumption abroad. I'll spare you the technical terms. But we have actually a way to deliver services through the merchandise exports. And in Europe, this is actually happening at a pace of 300 billion euros, our calculations per year, roughly a third of what we trade on goods in our statistics. And 8 million, just to give you another number, 8 million trade-related jobs in Europe are supported by this mode 5, 1 out of 4 of our export jobs. So it's clearly happening, and it's also clear that the services which are embedded in these goods are then facing the restrictions that goods usually face about rules of origin, about R&D software. And these routes are suboptimal, and sometimes they actually make it more difficult to trade because they make you tax sometimes the service within the good without having a good reason to do so. That's one example I want to give you. And our rules today don't really allow to take that into account. There are limited ways you can do it already. And here I'm getting very technical now. The WTO customs valuation rules allow for some duty-free preferential treatment of some of the services exports. And here I'm talking about design and artwork when they are re-imported. So you can put your service into a product which comes into your country and deduct the services that you already put into that import. But it's a very limited way to do this. And current trade rules may have to adapt. I mean, this is the bottom line. If we don't want to make trade unnecessarily difficult, then we actually have to make sure that we find a way to really adapt the rules to the mode 5 in world trade. And how to do that we are supportive and don't use rules of origin and other issues which might make it impossible to use also preferential rules by not counting the services at what they are, services and not goods. If we don't do that, we'll have more and more artificial, not only statistics which are wrong, because the statistics are wrong, because they look at goods, they don't look at the services in the good. But you also get trade rules which don't do what they do, which is to facilitate the free flow of services even when they are embedded in goods, and to have a maximum freedom for freedom of trading goods, even if they contain a lot of services. So this is where I want to stop. I don't want to monopolize the debate because there are many questions that you might have, but this is the context I wanted to give you. And I'm very pleased that in Brazil, in this discussion, there is so much interest. I think this is something where ultimately in the WTO, but beginning in the context of our discussions that we are having here, we have to create awareness of this. And this is also for us interesting to see that some of what we do in our value-added tax discussions are also part of the discussion here in Brazil on when you reform your own efforts for domestic, you have your own efforts for domestic reforms. One last word, because I'll be fired if I don't mention it. We have a new trade policy, the strategy out since 2 weeks that you might or might not have looked at. It covers all sorts of things, but it has quite a lot of the question of digital trade and how we deal with that. And it also mentions at least the point that I'm making here, the importance of services, the disruptive of digital services, and how we can actually do better in adopting in our rules to the real world. So let's continue this work in this forum, in the WTO, and hopefully also in the Mercosur agreement when it ever comes into force, bilaterally, region to region. We have avenues to discuss it, and this is one, and I'm very grateful, and thanks for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Deputy Director General. Lucian, would you like to take over?
Yes, thank you, Luiz. Well, first of all, also my sincere thanks for organizing this event, for keeping a discussion that is so important for all of us, as Rupert just mentioned, keeping this discussion going through the work that I know very well you carried out with the International Chamber of Commerce. You mapped the whole world in the quest for best practices, and I think this is one of those examples which are nowadays, as now that I'm no longer a chief trade economist, I'm head of the regulatory cooperation at DG Trade. I'm really looking forward to the exact same occasion to discuss best practices and regulatory cooperation with like-minded partners, just like we do today in the area of services. But as Rupert said, what are services nowadays? Do we really have a distinction between services? If the Volkswagen CEO declares that Volkswagen will be a software company, and if in December Apple decided that they want to be a car company, well, honestly, I don't understand anything then. If who is the car company, who is the software company? It seems that at the end of the day, you have to be both in order to succeed in global markets, and you need to understand how to interplay those critical elements, the 5G, the interconnected, the sensors in the wheels that will make that car safe, or the sensors on the banana plantation that will give you an indication when you need to put fertilizer and the right amount of fertilizer. Everyone needs to be in services at the end of the day. And as we know, services can be a powerful development path. Brazil is extremely well positioned to use services as an engine for development in areas where you have tremendous potential. I just looked recently now again at those elements that we discussed in Brasilia a while ago in our event with UNCTAD and many other representatives from the region, from Latin America. It's striking to see how similar the Brazilian services structure is with the European services structure. Of course, there's a difference in scale. There's a difference in the actual billions of euros involved, but the structure is extremely similar. The mode one, the digital services, account for 36% of services exports in Brazil. You have beaten us because in Europe we only have 32%. So digital services in Brazil are just as good, if not in terms of their relative proportion, slightly better in some areas than even in Europe. So you have an excellent platform to connect these digital services with the rest of the economy, which it's still based on manufacturing and agriculture, which remains an important driver. So how do we do this? And I think this is really the topic of our today's discussion. We need to find that bridge that Rupert mentioned between the existing trade rules. And you have identified a number of small paths. I mean, these are the kind of the off the beaten track, kind of really little paths that only Sherpas know. How to navigate between goods and services? Well, sometimes you need to understand cost of valuation. Sometimes you need to understand VAT rules. Sometimes the rules are in place, but companies do not fully understand how to use them. Just to give you one example from our European context, we have now discovered in a way, with some surprise even among ourselves, that there are rules in place in our own custom legislation that will allow, to take the Volkswagen example, that will allow a Volkswagen car, which is, as you know, built across global supply chains. Very few products are built in one single factory, in one single country. So imagine Volkswagen would like to send the most advanced pieces of the car somewhere in Asia or in Latin America, and then they will come back to Europe as a finished car. Now, our rules allow for some software to be actually deducted from the value of the car that would still be subject to duties until we have our FTA. Now, that kind of rule was really, even for a major company like BMW, Volkswagen, are not fully understood. So first of all, we have a duty as civil servants to map the existing rules, to understand where there are gaps. And as Rupert said, there are clear gaps. And these examples, these very few fortunate examples we have, are really the exception to the rule. The rule is that currently services that are drivers of manufacturing competitiveness are subject to discriminatory taxation. They are taxed in a way that they shouldn't be. And even when we have exemptions, they are poorly understood. So there's a double challenge for us to engage with ourselves across different silos. I mean, we have different departments trying to understand what's best for the European economy. I'm sure that in the Brazilian government, there's also now a reflection process on how to introduce business-friendly reforms, including on services. So the kind of dialogue we have today is essential. And if you have identified some best practices in Europe, or if you found them elsewhere, we will be more than happy to ensure that they are actually known and embraced by all these companies that work on a global scale. And that would be a perfect platform, a perfect starting point to ensure that our EU Mercosur FTA delivers on the ground in a way that we anticipated. So thank you very much for continuing the conversation, and I look forward actually to all the technical findings of the various presenters that will share with us these interesting elements. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucian. Now, Secretary Ferraz, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Luiz. Thank you, everybody, actually, I'd like to thank ICC first for the invitation. Just to say again, this is a pleasure to be here, sharing this panel with such a high qualified speakers, like Mr. Cernat, Mr. Rupert, and all the other colleagues that I can barely see here because there are many closed windows, but I can see some friendly faces at least. Luiz, I have a presentation. I just prepared something to show you. I will try to share it. Let me see. Yeah, it's here. Can you see this, everybody? Yeah.
Yes, we see that very clearly.
So let's try to start. So the idea here is to make a few comments on the relevance of service trade for the Brazilian economy. It's goes without saying, it's a very important topic for the global economy, and especially for our economy, for Brazil, that has its productivity stagnated for such a long time. And we are, of course, basically a services economy, as I will show in my presentation. So it's impossible to talk about productivity growth in Brazil without talking about trade in services and the services sector as a whole. So I will divide my presentation in 4 parts. I will start with giving you the broad picture on the evolution of services over the last decades. Then I will talk about service trade in the world and in Brazil, and I will highlight some key facts in our economy. And it will also show a brief summary of some CGE exercise that we have carried out in my secretariat, showing the likely impacts of services liberalization in our country. And third, I would like to highlight at least 3 initiatives on trading services that we have been discussing and implementing in our government. And then the fourth for my concluding remarks. So as you all know, the so-called new globalization started in the mid-80s and was underpinned by lower transportation costs, the ICT revolution, and the explosion of FTAs. Nowadays, we have more than 300 FTAs notified at the WTO. The fragmentation of production was disruptive, as we all know, and highly concentrated in the displacement of manufacturing jobs and the G7 economies, as you can see in both pictures in these slides. This is already a very known slide, the 2 very famous pizzas, showing that the fragmentation of production was largely followed by the servicification of manufacturing, as already mentioned by our previous speakers. Nowadays, products are bundles of manufactured goods and services, and new forms of complementarities between goods and services keep arising. So I'd like to call our attention to the fact that in a globalized world like the one we live, in a fragmented world like the one we live, we need to get used to look at trade statistics under the value-added logic. And when we do this, what we see is that basically 50% of our total exports corresponds to services, as you can see in the pizza in the right-hand side of this slide. The golden period, as I call it, of GVC formation took place between 1985 until 2008 with the global financial crisis. Since then, what we have been witnessing is the so-called globalization, a jargon that was created by the famous magazine, The Economist. In spite of that, as you can see in the graph, we still live in a hyper-globalized and potential deglobalization as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Still, we are witnessing since the 2008, the global financial crisis. Since then, trading services have been growing more rapidly than trading goods, at least until the outbreak of the current COVID-19 pandemic. Servicification, it's important to say, has been relatively more intense in developed economies than in developing ones, like Brazil. This can be partially explained by the new global trade pattern brought about by GVCs, where high-income countries became even more specialized in high value-added services exports, connected to production chains in lower-income countries in Asia. As you can see here in this picture again. So for some key empirical facts about services trade in the world and Brazil, first of all, like trading goods, there is no such thing as a large services exporter that is not a large services importer as well. This message is especially important in the case of Brazil. It must appear obvious to many people, but it's very important to Brazil, because here, most of the debates on sector competitiveness is still dominated by the idea of trade surpluses. And I usually try to emphasize in all the debates that I participate that trade surplus are not correlated with productivity gains, with productivity growth. What is correlated with productivity growth is the sum of exports and imports over GDP. But we are here in Brazil, it seems that we are still stuck in the paradigm, the old paradigm of having, of obtaining trade surpluses, regardless if we are talking about services or if you are talking about goods. Brazil is not a commodity exporter, nor a manufacturing exporter. This is a different view. You know, when you look at the trade figures according to the value-added logic, Brazil is not a commodity exporter, not a manufacturing exporter. Brazil is a services exporter. When trading value-added is taken into consideration, Brazil, like many other countries, is a services exporter. For every $1 of value-added exported by the Brazilian economy, almost 50 cents corresponds to domestic and imported services. There is a problem in Brazil. There is a reason for concern. The share of foreign services embodied in Brazil's exports is relatively low in comparison to other economies, especially developed economies. This is especially true in the case of Brazil's manufacturing exports, as you can see in this picture. Since imported services are usually high value-added services, I'm talking about tradable services, current high barriers to services imports that we have in Brazil may potentially be hampering, Brazil's exports competitiveness, especially in the manufacturing sector. Some additional evidence on this, when it comes to the share of modern services in total domestic services embodied in exports, developed economies manufacturing exports embody a higher share of modern services in comparison to Brazil. And here I selected two very important sectors for our economy. In the left-hand side, you have the vehicle sector, vehicle exports, and in the right-hand side, machines and equipment exports. Another reason for concern, in Brazil, and quite likely in the rest of the world, the higher the level of sophistication of a given manufacturing sector, the higher the share of modern services embodied in its exports. Starting from the textile sector until a very high-tech sector like the pharmaceutical one, you can see that the share of modern services embodied in exports is increasing according to the sophistication of each sector. Another reason for concern, with little participation in the global trade of both goods and services, labor productivity in services in Brazil is also very low in comparison to other economies, including developing economies. What is even worse, contrasting with the relevance of more sophisticated services for the competitiveness of goods exports, Brazil's labor productivity in modern services is even lower in comparison to labor productivity in traditional services, not modern services, but in traditional services in most developed economies. As you can see here, the labor productivity in sophisticated services in Brazil is even lower than traditional services in UK, Japan, Australia, France, Ireland, and USA. So we still have, you know, a long list of tasks, I mean, to move forward and try to improve our situation. Despite being among the 12 largest economies in the world, Brazil ranks 24th and 37th when it comes to country share in global services imports and exports, respectively. These figures are for 2019, the most recent that we have. So lower participation in the global trade in services. What are the reasons for this? Let's try to go deeper. This slide shows the estimated ad valorem equivalents of barriers to trade in services, a comparison between the OECD average, Brazil, and the Latin America average. And you can see here that barriers to the imports of commercial services in Brazil, I'm talking about commercial services, are estimated to be lower than Latin America's average, but far above the ones estimated for the OECD economies, like you can see here in construction services, insurance, financial services, and etc. It's needless to say, there is plenty empirical evidence suggesting causality between reducing barriers to the import of services and greater productivity and competitiveness in goods exports. Lots of published papers, well-published papers in very, very important economic journals. This is for the CGE modeling here. So the effects of lowering barriers to services imports in Brazil to the level of OECD average. This is a hypothetical exercise, but that would bring, you know, widespread positive impacts over some of the most important macroeconomic variables in our country, including GDP, volume exported, volume imported, investment, and wages, qualified and non-qualified. The impact of the reduction of each services import barrier will be proportional to its current magnitude, but also to the relevance of a given services for each macro variable. So I call your attention to the importance of business services, which are modern services, to GDP growth, to volume exported growth, to volume imported, and to investment, especially investment here, especially in the case of construction services, also very important, and also to highlight the importance of financial services and etc. So modern services are really important, you know, for our economy. Last, when it comes to trade performance, as expected, at least according to the previous empirical literature, services liberalization has indeed a positive impact over all export sectors in our country, especially on manufacturing exports, as you can see in this picture. This is, as I said, the result of a CGE, of a static CGE modeling exercise. So for the SESEX initiatives, the Secretaria de Comércio Exterior, I'd like to highlight at least three very important dimensions of our trade agenda when it comes to trading services. First of all, free trade agreements. Secondly, the drawback regime. And third, the double taxation agreements. Brazil, as you know, has recently concluded trade negotiations with the European Union, the European Free Trade Association, the so-called EFTA countries, and is currently negotiating with Canada, South Korea, and Singapore. We have a formal services chapter negotiated with Chile, the European Union, and the EFTA countries. We expect negotiations with Canada, South Korea, and Singapore, the ongoing negotiations, to contain deeper, even deeper provisions in services. We have just concluded the negotiations on electronic commerce, on an electronic commerce protocol with Mercosur country, which was last December. We also concluded a very important bilateral protocol with the United States containing state-of-the-art provisions on trade facilitation, which is, of course, a very important service for our economy and for the rest of the world in general, I would say. And at the WTO, we have been deeply engaged in the negotiations of, Brazil has been deeply engaged in the negotiations of services domestic regulation, like never before, I would say, never before, we have been so engaged, e-commerce negotiations, investment facilitation, and we are currently negotiating Brazil accession to the government procurement agreement at the WTO. For the drawback regime, this is a special customs regime, as you all know. This is a regime that we can find in most of the countries in the global economy. It encourages companies of the most diverse size and sectors to join international trade flows by either importing or purchasing goods inputs in the domestic market with either tax suspensions or exemptions whenever inputs are used in the production of exported goods. Our idea now is to expand the drawback regimes to include input services. That is, let's say, a very preliminary idea. We don't have a formal proposal for this expansion, but this is something that we have been thinking about. As you know, the taxation for imported services input in Brazil is very high. It's nearly 45%. So it's of course explain, at least in part, the very low participation of foreign services embedded in goods exports in our economy. And of course, there is a point of attention, the potential for high loss in terms of federal revenues. Just for you to have an idea, Brazil exported 65 billion in services inputs embedded in its goods exports in 2019. So it's a lot. We're not talking about lower figures. And at the moment, as you know, Brazil is in a very delicate fiscal situation. We are trying to recover our fiscal balance. And this discussion, even though very, very important, perhaps you have to wait for a better moment in terms of fiscal conditions in our country. And lastly, for the double taxation agreements, Brazil currently has a network of DTAs comprising 33 countries and 4 more in the process of ratification. DTAs with Singapore, Switzerland, and United Emirates have just been approved by the Brazilian Congress. But of course, we want more. We would like to formalize DTAs with strategic partners like Germany, the United States, and the United Kingdom, which of course are very important trade partners for the Brazilian economy when it comes to trading services. And my concluding remarks, so despite its importance for productivity and Brazil's long-term GDP growth, services have only recently become part of Brazil's trade policy agenda. I must say that there is still quite a few policymakers in our country that still believe that trades are non-tradable. These are non-tradable sectors. So we need to explain to those guys that they are completely wrong. And then we need to think about services like tradables. The trading services is very important, as we have emphasized during this presentation. The industrial sector in Brazil is far behind when it comes to the adoption of the new technologies related to Industry 4.0. Services imports are strategic for catching up with the latest in the international frontier. As suggested in this presentation, a greater access of Brazilian companies to imported services is indeed, able to increase exports in all sectors in our economy, especially in manufacturing. The most efficient way to liberalize trading services, of course, it must be said, would be through tax reductions across the board. But that would be very expensive in terms of tax exemptions and tax suspensions. So in the meantime, perhaps gradually, what we could try to do is to expand our special customs regimes like drawback, and that could contribute to level the playing field for Brazilian exports in the global market, mainly because most of the countries, as I said, especially the G20 economies, they use regimes similar to drawback, including services. This policy should take into consideration, of course, as I said, our country's budget constraint. And then the biggest barrier, the last phrase, to trade in Brazil are, of course, not regulatory in nature when it comes to commercial services, but instead are of a tax nature. So our problem, our biggest challenge at the moment is to reduce the tax burden over the imports of services in our country. And then we believe if we can do this, we will improve our productivity. We will at least improve the level of competitiveness of our country's exports. This is more or less what I had to say today, and I would like to thank you again for your time. And I'm looking forward to keep talking to you about on this topic. Thank you. Sharing here.
Thank you very, very much, Secretary Ferraz. We know, I mean, how hard you and your team have thought about those issues and tried to implement them within the constraints that we have. I think constraints they take place in pretty much any country. I mean, policy making is about making difficult choices. In terms of our ICC Brasil work on the topic, what I would encourage everyone listening here to do, and what I think is part of our agenda at the Trade Policy Committee here, is to support those developments, to be at in your team's disposal to contribute to that work. Very, very important work that SEX has tried to push for, and to try to probably express to our decision makers that notwithstanding the difficulty of the choices, I mean, what we're doing today in Brazil is effectively we're taxing our exports, which are one of the ways we would have to catch up after this sort of prolonged period of difficulty that I think, I mean, other countries are also facing. But we are a little bit behind in terms of or a lot behind in terms of the rule structure, so to speak, to boost that recovery, at least as far as exports are concerned. Now, I would like to open the floor for questions. There are two possibilities for us to receive your questions. For those of you who are on YouTube, you can use the chat function, and these questions will be passed on to us, and we can make them here. And for those of you who are already in the Zoom room, you can just raise your hand. I'll wait for maybe 10, 15 seconds, and then, since I'm very curious, if no one has a question, I'll probably start. Okay. Anyone? Okay. There's one place, Secretary Ferraz, at your presentation, which kind of struck me. I mean, there's a way to think about services in terms of value added, which is kind of twofold. We have, I think this is probably Jorge Arbach's construction, but we have sort of cost services, those services that we need to purchase in order to export. So if they're unproductive, it's like a tax. I mean, it's a burden on exports. And we also have services that actually, I mean, they add value to exports. That's probably not the way an economist would picture this way, because in both ways we have added value, but there are some services that are mandatory, right? And if we have to export, I mean, transportation is kind of a sensitive issue. And in your presentation, that item kind of struck me. Transportation's costs are particularly high in Brazil. We're a big country. Logistics is complicated, infrastructure. So could you develop a little bit on that part? Because you touched upon business services, and I think also other services, but I suspect one important component is transportation. So if you could just, say a few words about that aspect.
Yes, this is a very, as you mentioned, Luiz, thank you very much for your question. Transportation services are very important, as we could see, in the pictures for the Brazilian economy when it comes to services embedded, in our country's exports. I would like to at least highlight two main reasons why service transportation is so important and at the same time expensive for the Brazilian economy. First of all, I'd like to mention the issue of remoteness. At least I mentioned three factors actually. Remoteness, Brazil is the location of our economy is far away, let's say, from the big traders in the world, like the United States, the European Union, and China. So this is the first factor why trade in transportation services is so expensive, is so important, when it comes to services costs, as you mentioned. Yeah. The second factor that I would like to highlight is the level of competitiveness or the level of competition that we have when it comes to trade, to transportation, services transportation supply in the specific case of Brazil. And then I would like to emphasize, for instance, the need or the importance of opening up the regional maritime transportation market that we have in Mercosur. This is still a closed market. You have it's completely protected. We don't have the participation of foreign vessels, from other countries in this maritime transportation, with exception made with Chile, but we are still very much closed, when it comes to trade with Argentina, Uruguay, and etc. in the Mercosur region. And also the good news is that at least with the Europeans, we succeeded in opening up this so-called regional cabotage market for European vessels. This is good news. This will, for sure, in the coming future, reduce the costs, the freight, when it comes to maritime transportation costs. As you said, this is a very important services sector in our economy. I think the only and then the third evidence, which I think also helps to explain why transportation services is so important in Brazil in terms of costs. Brazil is not a big international player when it comes to international trade. So the more you trade, the lower, everything else constant, of course, the lower the freight you pay when it comes to transportation, to maritime transportation costs. If you don't trade a lot, usually it means that you're going to pay higher freight costs in comparison to other countries that trade more than you. Those would be my 2 cents, answering your question, your very important question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm not on mute. Thank you very much. Now, unless our guests from the EU would like to say something in reaction to that question, I also have a question for them, and feel free to tackle it as you will. And it concerns kind of the connection between what you have referred to as mode 5 and mode 4. I think there's there's a growing amount of discussion about this. There is also a huge potential for telemigration, so to speak, as our interconnection increases. So what I would like to hear is if there is anything about this in the EU's trade policy vision and agenda for the short or medium term. I mean, the connection between trade and the possibility that people provide services across borders as kind of work, right? Because today, I mean, we can work pretty much from anywhere. So that's an issue where there's also a developed kind of potential agenda going forward.
Yeah, Luiz, maybe I can say one word, but Lucian is probably a much better place to look at the cutting edge things here. I just wanted to say two things. First of all, I'm pleased to see that our agenda, the EU and the Mercosur agenda, will contribute, obviously because services liberalization is part of the agreement. So we really have a tool here to lower some of these costs that we are discussing here. And the other point I wanted to make, I heard the fiscal argument from Lucas that you can't just liberalize everything because the fiscal effect would be very high if you would take services out of all of these equations. And we are really trying to also see with our tools, we have these outward processing rules where we say you can re-import the things without counting your services again. Whether that isn't the first step in this direction, because this is really the most obvious penalization of your own exports, if you wish. So, I mean, anything we can do, and I'm trying to find out as we speak. I asked a question to some of my colleagues: what are we actually doing ourselves? How much uptake is there for these outward processing rules? Because even in Europe, these things are not very well known, and not everyone makes use of this. The other, and then that was my main comment. I think I leave it now to Lucian to talk about the telemigration aspects, which I really have not much to say because I'm not really very cited on this issue. But it's obviously, given the crisis, made us all work, the teleworkers, is certainly an important part of the debate as it unfolds. And I hope that Lucian will enlighten you a little bit more.
Thank you, Rupert. You left the difficult questions for me. I can see that. In reality, I think we are all struggling to understand the implications of not just the new the disruptive technologies that have been with us for quite a while, but also the new challenges and the new opportunities that at the same time offered by COVID. I mean, probably in normal circumstances, some of us would have attended in person an event like this. And I don't need to ask you how many of these events you have done nowadays virtually as opposed to traveling abroad, which in fact starts to put into question also the relative importance of what we negotiated under the GATS a while ago. I mean, in strict sense of what Rupert and I were doing now is, if we were to get paid for it, although we're not, so we're not on a commercial basis here, but if we were to be consultants trying to work with Brazilian counterparts or Brazilian clients, we would all of a sudden no longer provide services under mode 4, but under mode 1. And this would be the kind of things that we see now more and more. In the new area I'm responsible for, which is certification, metrology, certificates of conformity. Nowadays, a producer, say in Brazil, may be actually inspected remotely by a conformity agency in Europe. We've seen that in the kind of crisis period where people still had to issue such inspection audits or otherwise. So we started to make use of these technologies already. So what exactly will it mean? I think it brings us back to the leitmotif, I think, of our entire session today. We need to find a way for us to keep our trade rules in sync with business and technological realities. We're not very good at that, unfortunately, all the time, because it takes decades for us to agree on new rules. But when we do agree on new rules, and the EU-Mercosur FTA is just a perfect example of a cutting-edge 21st century agreement we took so long to negotiate. Now it's time to put it to work for the benefits of our economies. So the same on these modes of supply, mode 5, I mean, it's not so important how we call it. The important thing is to ensure that when companies need to put together services and other parts of a product, we give them a consistent set of rules, and the one that makes most sense both for them and for us as public authorities. So I won't have much more to say, I'm afraid, on these new things. I'm also catching up with what happens in this post-COVID world, but I think we'll see more and more a very, very symbiotic interplay in the business world between things that we as policymakers, we think that they're separate, and they will be brought to work together much more intimately than before. So we need to create this cross-cutting sort of interlinkages also in our rules. Duty drawback, an excellent idea. We are, as Rupert said, we also think of how to make use of it. Custom valuation, Article 8 in the custom valuation agreement. If we wanted to modernize the WTO, this is my message also to our Brazilian friends who may have a very strong voice in Geneva now. Let's try to modernize Article 8 custom valuation. It was written on a typewriter. And nowadays it is that article written on a typewriter that affects the way in which we tax software embedded in cars. That reality did not exist. We cannot blame the drafters because it wasn't there. But it's our duty now to bring it up to speed. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if Secretary Ferraz or Renato Agostinho would like to say something about the issue of that I raised just out of the blue, just because I think it's probably, okay, it's very hard to guess things. And in Brazil, I think it's even harder to guess since, I mean, things change all the time. But I think telemigration is one place where this services agenda can definitely move as far as developing countries are concerned. So I don't know if either Lucas or Renato would like to say something about that in general, even if it doesn't involve a customs regime or.
Just briefly, Luiz, this is a very important topic, of course, you know, when it comes to the future of our economies and trade and services and whatever. But as you could see in my presentation, we are at the moment focused on doing the basic homework. Yeah, so we are still perhaps one step back, you know, in this discussion. But of course, we must keep an eye on it. I wonder whether Renato Agostinho would like to say a few words on this. I leave the hard questions to him.
No comments about that.
Yeah.
Okay, and Renato, also feel free if you would like to complement or say, or either in English or Portuguese, up to you.
Okay, thank you, Luiz. I would just like to add some comments with respect to the conclusions of the study we have commissioned on how G20 countries avoid charging taxes on services embedded in manufactured exported goods. 10 G20 members, Germany, France, Italy, the UK, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Argentina, Mexico, and the European Union as a bloc, relieve taxes charged on services embedded in exported goods by two ways, with provisions in their general tax legislation and using special customs regimes. All these economies combine both approaches, even though they set a VAT system with an efficient and fast mechanism to rebate or refund tax credits accrued in previous stages of the exported goods production. The reason for this is quite clear, as they are simply putting the destination principle into practice, which means countries should not tax their exports. These countries thus promote a better and cost-effective access to services by exporting manufacturers. In this scenario, we can conclude that establish a special regime, as Secretary Lucas Ferraz said, which allows the suspension or exemption of taxes levied on services embedded in exported goods, represents a good alternative in order to comply with the destination principle and to improve the exporting company's cash flow. So instead of paying taxes to rebate or refund them after the export operation, it's better not to collect these taxes at all. This is even more relevant in Brazil, where we have a tax burden about 45% on imported service, as the secretary said, and 20% on domestic ones. So that's my comments. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much, Renato Agostinho, also for all your work carrying this agenda forward. if I don't know, I'd like to leave one minute for our guests to make concluding comments, if they will, because we then after the session we're going to continue with our ordinary meeting of the Trade Policy Commission with our agenda. So maybe we can start with our guests from the EU and on to Secretary Ferraz and Undersecretary Agostinho.
No, from my side, just a big thanks. I think we need to keep this kind of dialogue, which will, over time, certainly change the landscape. It's glacial, I know, but it needs to be done. So I think I'm very happy to have these discussions and continue interacting with you on all these themes, which make the EU-Brazil Mercosur relationship work better. Thank you.
Thank you, Luiz. Thank you, ICC, for this great initiative, in trying to promote this very important debate here in our country, inviting very important, speakers like the ones that we had today. I'd like to finish my my participation here, perhaps complementing what was said briefly by my Undersecretary Renato Agostinho. Most of, as we said, the biggest problem that we have when it comes to the import of services in our country is of a tax nature. That was my conclusion in my presentation. And whenever we, of course, try to discuss this issue in the government, of course, we need to, let's say, align our position with our federal revenue services, the RIS in Brazil. And as you know, Brazil nowadays is under the process of discussing a comprehensive tax reform in our country. And I'd like to highlight, as I have already done, inside the government, discussing in conversations with our colleagues from the Federal Revenue Services. And I'd like to stress this as my final words here. We don't need a comprehensive tax reform, in order to do something regarding services trade liberalization in our country. As the study, as the research conducted by Luiz, and his team showed, to us, there are many countries, including developed economies, that have, a very good and working value-added tax regime. And also they take advantage of special customs regimes like drawback, including services, covering services. So I'd like to stress this. We don't need to wait 5, 6, 10 years for a very comprehensive tax reform. We can try to do things in parallel. And of course, we need to respect the very delicate fiscal condition that we have at the moment. But I think in the coming future, in the aftermath of this crisis, and when the fiscal condition allow us, to do this, we could think carefully about implementing, extending the drawback regime, and try to give some tax relief to our exporters in our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And with that, I think I'll hand it to Gabriela with a huge thanks and goodbye to everyone, and then encourage you to watch all of the episodes of our series, which are on ICC Brasil's YouTube channel. This is not a very, I think, easy topic to discuss. It bogs our minds a bit, at least mine. But let's not stop there. We have to have difficult conversations sometimes, and in order to improve, situations that are complex too. So thank you all again. Thank you. Thanks for the ICC for hosting us, and well, next time. Until next time.
Thank you all. Thank you, Rupert, Lucas, Renato, and Lucian. This was a pleasure listening to you. And as Luiz said, please do count on us to keep this agenda moving forward. Even if it's at glacial speed, it has to keep moving forward. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.